everyone. Today we are going to be reading chapters 17 and 18 in Mr. Popper's Penguins. So let's get to it. Chapter 17, Fame. The birds soon became so famous that whenever it was known that Popper performing penguins were to appear at any theater, the crowds would stand in line for half a mile down the street waiting their turn to buy tickets. The other actors on the program were not always so pleased, however. Once, in Minneapolis, a celebrated lady opera singer got very much annoyed when she heard that the Popper Penguins were to appear on the same program. In fact, she refused to go on stage unless the penguins were put away. So the stage hands helped Mr. and Mrs. Popper and the children get the birds off the stage and downstairs to the basement, under the stage, while the manager guarded the stage entrance to make sure that the penguins did not get past. Down in the basements, the birds soon discovered another little flight of steps going up, and in another minute the audience was shrieking with laughter as the penguins' heads suddenly appeared one by one in the orchestra pit where the musicians were playing. The musicians kept on playing, and the lady on the stage, when she saw the penguins, sang all the louder to show how angry she was. The audience was laughing so hard that nobody could hear the words of her song. Mr. Popper, who had followed the penguins up the stairs, stopped when he saw that it led to the orchestra pit. "I don't think I'm supposed to go up there with the musicians," he told Mrs. Popper. "The penguins did," said Mrs. Popper. "Papa, you'd better get them off before they start biting the pegs and strings off fiddles," said Bill. "Oh dear, I don't know what to do," said Mr. Popper, sitting down helplessly on the top step. "Then I will catch the penguins," said Mrs. Popper, climbing up past him, with Janey and Bill following. When they saw Mrs. Popper coming after them, the penguins felt very guilty, because they knew they did not belong there. So they jumped up on the stage, ran over the footlights, and hid under the singing lady's blue skirts. That stopped the singing entirely, except for one high, shrill note that had not been written in the music. The birds loved the bright lights of the theater and the great laughing audiences and all the traveling. There was always something new to see. From Stillwater out to the Pacific coast they traveled. It was a long way now to the little house at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, where the Poppers had had to worry about whether their money would hold out until spring. And every week they got a check for $5,000. When they were not actually playing in some theater or traveling on trains between cities, their life was spent in larger hotels. Now and then a startled hotel keeper would object to having the birds registered there. "Why, we don't even allow lapdogs in this hotel," he would say. "Yes, but do you have any rule against penguins?" said Mr. Popper would ask. Then the hotel keeper would have to admit that there was no rule at all about penguins, and of course, when he saw how neat the penguins were, and how other guests came to the hotel in hope of seeing them, he was very glad to have them. You might think that a large hotel would offer a great many opportunities for mischief to a lot of penguins, but they behaved very well, on the whole, never doing anything worse than riding up and down too often in the elevators, and occasionally biting the brass buttons off of some bellboy's uniform. $5,000 a week may sound like a great deal of money, and yet the Poppers were far from rich. It was quite expensive to live in grand hotels and travel about town in taxicabs. Mr. Popper often thought the penguins could just as well have walked back and forth between hotels and theaters, but every one of their walks looked so much like a parade that it always tied up the traffic. So Mr. Popper, who never liked to be a nuisance to anyone, always took taxis instead. It was expensive to have huge cakes of ice brought up to their hotel rooms to cool the penguins. The bills in the fine restaurants where the Poppers often took their meals were often dreadfully high. Fortunately, however, the penguins' food had stopped being an expense to them. On the road, they had to give up having tanks of cars of live fish shipped to them, because it was so hard to get deliveries on them, so they went back to feeding the birds on canned shrimps. This cost them absolutely nothing, for Mr. Popper had written a testimonial saying, "Popper's performing penguins thrive on Owen's oceanic shrimp." This statement, with a picture of the 12 penguins, was printed in all the leading magazines, and the Owens Oceanic Shrimp Company gave Mr. Popper an order that was good for free cans of shrimp at any grocery store anywhere in the country. Several other companies, such as the Great Western Spinach Growers Association and the energetic Breakfast Oats Company, wanted him to recommend their product too, and offered him large sums of cash. But the penguins simply refused to eat spinach or oats, and Mr. Popper was much too honest to say that they would, even though he knew that the money would come in handy. From the Pacific coast they turned east again to cross the continent, and had time enough on this brief tour to touch only the larger cities. After Minneapolis, they played Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. Wherever they went, their reputation traveled ahead of them. When early in April they reached Boston, huge crowds awaited them in the railway station. Up to now, it had not been too difficult to keep the penguins comfortable, but a warm spring wind was blowing across Boston Common, and at the hotel Mr. Popper had to have the ice brought up to his rooms in 1,000-pound cakes. He was glad that the 10-week contract was almost up, and that next week, when his birds were to appear in New York, was the last. Already, Mr. Greenbaum was writing about a new contract. Mr. Popper was beginning to think, however, that he had better be getting back to Stillwater, for the penguins were growing irritable. All right. Chapter 18. April Winds. If it was unseasonably warm in Boston, it was actually hot in New York. In their rooms at the Great Tower Hotel overlooking Central Park, the penguins were feeling the heat badly. Mr. Popper took them up to the roof garden to catch whatever cool breeze might be blowing. The penguins were all charmed by the sparkling lights and the confusion of the city below. The younger birds began crowding over the edge of the roof and looking down at the great canyons beneath them. It made Mr. Popper very nervous to see them shoving each other, as if at any moment they might succeed in pushing one over. He remembered how the South Pole penguins always did this to find out what danger lay below. The roof was not a safe place for them. Mr. Popper had never forgotten how badly frightened he had been when Captain Cook had been so ill before Greta came. He could not risk the chance of losing one of his penguins now. Where the penguins were concerned, nothing was ever too much trouble for him. He took them downstairs again and bathed them under the cold showers in the bathroom. This kept him busy a large part of the night. With all this lack of sleep, he was quite drowsy the next morning when he had to call the taxis to get to the theater. Besides, Mr. Popper had always been a little absent-minded. That is how he made his great mistake when he said to the first taxi driver, "Regal Theater." "Yes, sir," said the driver, threading his way in and out of traffic of Broadway, which greatly interested both the children and the penguins. They had almost reached the theater when the driver suddenly turned. "Say," he said, "you don't mean to say those penguins are going to be on the same bill with Swenson's seals, do you?" "I don't know what else is on the bill," said Mr. Popper, paying him. "Anyway, here's the Regal," and they piled out and filed on the stage entrance. In the wings stood a largely burly, red-faced man. "So these are the Popper performing penguins, huh?" he said. "Well, I want to tell you, Mr. Popper, that I'm Swen Swenson, and those are my seals in there on the stage now. And if your birds try any funny business, it'll be too bad for them. My seals are tough, see? They'd think nothing of eating 2 or 3 penguins apiece." From the stage could be heard the hoarse barks of the seals, who were going through their act. "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "the penguins are the last act on the bill. You go run back quick and get those taxis, and we'll let the penguins ride around until it's time for their number." Mr. Popper hurried out to catch the drivers. When he returned, it was too late. The Popper performing penguins had already discovered the Swenson seals. "Papa, I can't look," cried the children. There was a sound of dreadful confusion on the stage. The audience was in uproar, and the curtain was quickly rung down. When the Poppers rushed to the stage, both penguins and seals had found the stairway leading to the Swenson dressing room and were on their way upstairs. "I can't bear to think what's happening up there," said Mr. Popper with a shudder. Mr. Swenson only laughed. "I hope your birds were insured, Popper," he said. "How much were they worth?" "Well, let's go up and look." "You go up, Papa," said Mrs. Popper. "Bill, you run out to the theater and call the police to come and try to save some of our penguins." "I'll go get the fire department," said Janey. When the firemen with a great clanging came and set up their ladders so that they could get in through the window of Mr. Swenson's dressing room, they were a little vexed to find there was no fire at all. However, when they found 6 black mustached seals sitting barking in the middle of the room with 12 penguins parading around them in a square, they felt better. Then the policemen came in their patrol and climbed the ladder which the firemen had left against the building. By the time they too came through the window, they could scarcely believe their eyes, for the firemen had put firemen's helmets on the penguins, which made the delighted birds look very silly and girlish. Seeing the firemen so friendly with the penguins, the policemen naturally took sides with the seals and put policemen's caps on them. The seals looked very fierce, with their long black mustaches and black faces underneath. The penguins under their firemen's helmets were parading in front of the policemen, while the seals, in their policemen's caps, were barking at the firemen, when Mr. Popper and Mr. Swenson finally opened the door. Wearing their caps. Mr. Popper sat down. His relief was so great that for a moment he could not speak. "You policemen had better get your hats off my seals now," said Mr. Swenson. "I got to go down to the stage and finish the act now." Then he and his 6 seals slipped out of the room with a few parting barks. "Well, goodbye, ducks," said the firemen, regretfully removing their helmets from the penguins and putting them on their own heads. Then they disappeared down the ladder. The penguins, of course, wanted to follow, but Mr. Popper held them back. Just then the door flew open, and the theater manager burst into the room. "Hold that man!" he shouted to the policeman, pointing at Mr. Popper. "I have a warrant for his arrest." "Who, me?" said Mr. Popper in a daze. "What have I done?" "You've broken into my theater and thrown the place into a panic. That's what you've done. You're a disturber of the peace." "But I'm Mr. Popper, and these are my performing penguins, famous from coast to coast." "I don't care who you are. You haven't any business in my theater." "But Mr. Greenbaum is going to pay us $5,000 for a week at the Regal." "Mr. Greenbaum's theater is the Royal, not the Regal. You've come to the wrong theater. Anyway, out you go. You and your performing penguins. The patrol is waiting outside." That's the end of chapter 18. We'll finish the book, the last 2 chapters, next time. See you in the next video.